I could barely walk when I stepped off the army shuttle. By sunset, my husband had called me a burden. My mother-in-law had thrown me and my 10-year-old daughter out of their house, and I was driving through a Kentucky thunderstorm, wondering how my entire life had fallen apart in less than 12 hours. My name is Claire Dawson. I was 46 years old, and I had spent 22 years serving in the United States Army as a logistics officer. I never thought of myself as a hero or anyone special. I simply believed that when your country asked you to do a job, you did it as well as you could. My final deployment had been in Kuwait. 3 months before I came home, a military transport truck slid off a flooded road during a supply mission. We survived, but my left leg never fully recovered. The doctors repaired what they could, yet the nerve damage remained. The Army told me I would probably always walk with a limp. I believed I could live with that. I never imagined my own family could not. Brian barely looked up from his phone when I walked through the front door of our house in Lexington. "You're home," he said. There was no hug, no smile, and no relief in his voice. Just those 2 words. Emma ran to me before I could put down my duffel bag. "Mom!" She hugged me carefully, as if warned not to squeeze too hard. I kissed her head and told her how much I had missed her. In the dining room hung a crooked construction paper banner. "Welcome home, Mom." Some letters were backward. It was the most beautiful thing I had seen in over a year. My mother-in-law, Linda Dawson, sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee as if she owned the house. She looked me over, pausing at my injured leg. "So this is how you came back." I forced a smile and told her the doctors believed I would keep improving. She only shrugged. "I guess we'll see." Dinner was unnaturally quiet. Brian barely spoke while Emma talked about school, soccer, and the stray cat behind the garage. Every time she laughed, he looked irritated. After she went upstairs, he finally spoke. "We need to be honest with each other." I knew that tone. I had heard soldiers use it before delivering bad news. I asked him what was wrong. He rubbed his forehead and said he had not expected things to be like this. I looked down at my leg. "You mean because I'm limping?" "I mean everything." He stood and walked toward the window. "I've been thinking for months." My stomach tightened. Then he said the words that changed everything. "I don't think I can do this anymore." "I do what?" "This marriage." The room closed in around me. I said I had spent a year wondering if I would make it home. He said he had spent it realizing he did not want to care for someone for the rest of his life. I stared at him. "I don't need someone to take care of me." "You say that now." Before I could answer, Linda entered with my suitcase and dropped it beside the door. She claimed she was sorry, then said Brian deserved a chance to be happy. They had already decided. This was not a conversation. It was an eviction. Emma came downstairs at that exact moment and froze when she saw the suitcase. "Mom?" Brian would not even look at his own daughter. I lowered myself as carefully as I could and held her close. I told her we were going for a little drive. "In the rain?" she asked. "Yeah." She nodded without asking anything else. Children always know more than adults think they do. 20 minutes later, we left Lexington in sheets of rain. I had only one destination, the childhood farmhouse I had avoided for nearly 20 years. I had assumed I would sell it someday. By sunrise, it would change everything I believed about my past and future. The rain never let up. It hammered against my old Ford Explorer so hard that the headlights barely cut through the darkness. Interstate 64 was nearly empty, except for the occasional semi-truck throwing walls of water across my windshield. Emma fell asleep about an hour outside Lexington. She still had her little pink backpack on her shoulders. She must have grabbed it before we left. Inside it were the things that mattered most to her: a stuffed rabbit she had owned since kindergarten, a chapter book she was halfway through, and knowing my daughter, at least 3 snack bars she had hidden from her father. I wished life could remain that simple. The farther east I drove, the more familiar the roads became. Old gas stations, white-steepled churches, and feed stores I had not seen since my 20s. After Dad died 18 years earlier, every room and fence post at the farm reminded me of him. I locked it, paid the taxes, and promised to return someday. Someday had arrived. At around 1:30 in the morning, I turned onto Miller Creek Road. The narrow blacktop gave way to gravel, and the tires crunched beneath the Explorer. Even through the rain, I recognized every bend. I saw the old grain silo that had leaned to one side for as long as I could remember, the abandoned red barn where my friends and I had once played hide-and-seek, and the tiny cemetery where my grandparents rested beneath matching limestone markers. When the farmhouse finally appeared, my chest tightened. The porch light was on. That made no sense. No one had lived there for years. I parked beneath the giant maple tree Dad had planted when I was in middle school. The rain softened to a steady drizzle. Before I could open my door, someone stepped onto the porch. He moved slowly and leaned on a cane, but even from a distance I recognized him. Walter Jenkins smiled. I was wondering how long it would take you. Walter was now in his 80s, with thinning white hair and rounded shoulders, but the same smile. I climbed out carefully, my leg protesting. Walter noticed. So it finally caught up with you. I laughed softly. I guess it did. He looked toward Emma, asleep inside the Explorer. That's your little girl? Emma. She's beautiful. Then he reached into the pocket of his old canvas jacket. I've been waiting a long time to give you something. He pulled out an ancient manila envelope, its edges worn soft beneath a plastic sleeve. Across the front were 4 words, "For Claire when she comes home." My heart skipped. I knew that handwriting. Dad. Walter nodded. He left it with me. My throat tightened. When? The week before he passed. I stared at him. He knew I was coming tonight? Walter shook his head. No, he didn't know when. He only said that one day, life would bring you back here. Rain dripped steadily from the porch roof. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked why he had not mailed it. Walter smiled sadly. Because Frank made me promise. He said if I mailed it, you would read it. But if I handed it to you here, you would understand it. I looked at the faded farmhouse, Dad's porch swing, and Mom's wind chime moving in the breeze. For the first time since Lexington, curiosity pushed through my heartbreak. Walter rested a weathered hand on my shoulder. He told me to bring Emma inside for a warm meal. Then he said I could learn why Dad had spent his final year writing almost every day. The envelope suddenly felt much heavier than paper should. Walter insisted that we go inside before opening it. He said the furnace still worked, even if it was not pretty. The farmhouse smelled exactly as I remembered. Old pine floors, fresh coffee, and a hint of cedar from the closet by the front door. The furniture had barely changed. Dad's recliner still faced the stone fireplace. His reading glasses rested on the small table beside it, as though he had only stepped outside for a few minutes. For one painful second, I forgot he had been gone for 18 years. Emma wandered quietly through the living room. She asked whether Grandpa had lived there all by himself. I told her he had. She ran her fingers across the old piano and said she wished she had met him. I told her I wished that too. Walter served homemade chicken soup and told us some things were easier to hear on a full stomach. By the time we finished, the storm had faded to a drizzle. Walter pushed the envelope across the table. I think it's time. The brittle envelope held a 2-page letter. At the top, in Dad's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words. My dear Claire, if you're reading this. I stopped breathing for a moment. Walter looked out the window, quietly giving me privacy. I unfolded the 2nd page and continued. Dad wrote that if life had brought me home, something had gone terribly wrong. I began to cry. He admired my belief in second chances, but there was one man he had never trusted. I knew the name before I read it, Brian. I looked up at Walter. You knew. He nodded slowly and said my father had spoken to him. A year before my wedding, while I was away at training, Brian had visited Dad without telling me. He asked who owned the farm, how much land it included, what Dad had saved, whether he had life insurance, and whether everything would one day belong to me. Dad had recorded every question and the exact date, nearly 20 years earlier, before Brian proposed, before Emma was born, and before I suspected anything. The next paragraph was harder to read. Dad wrote that he had prayed he was wrong. He hoped Brian was simply immature. People grew and changed, and for my sake, he wanted to believe Brian would too. Dad had never once spoken badly about my husband. Even when I assumed they simply did not have much in common, my father had carried these concerns alone. Dad said that if I was reading the letter, his fears were probably justified. I must not blame myself. Some people loved only what they could gain, and when nothing remained to take, they left. Emma reached across the table and quietly took my hand. She asked whether I was all right. I told her I was, even though it was not true. I needed her to believe it. Then came something unexpected. After Brian's visit, Dad hired Winchester attorney Harold Benson and created a trust in my name. The farmhouse, acreage, mineral rights, investments, and the rest of his estate were protected. I stared at the words. "What trust?" Walter smiled gently. "You really didn't know?" I shook my head. Dad had never mentioned any of it. Walter brought an old wooden box from beside the fireplace. Inside were dozens of black notebooks, each labeled by year. "Frank Miller's journals," Walter said. "Claire, your father wrote almost every day." I looked at the stack. There appeared to be 20 years of his thoughts inside that box, and somehow I knew the letter had only scratched the surface. I did not sleep. Emma curled beneath one of Mom's quilts and drifted off almost immediately. Children find peace in places where adults carry painful memories. I envied her. The farmhouse was silent except for the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway. Each hour it chimed, reminding me how much of my life had passed without my seeing what had been directly in front of me. Walter left shortly after midnight. Before he went, he placed his hand on the wooden box and told me not to rush through the journals. My father had not been writing history, he said. He had been writing to me. At around 2 in the morning, I carried the first notebook into the kitchen. The cover read 2005, the year before Brian and I married. I made coffee, knowing sleep was not coming. Dad's handwriting filled every page. Some entries were ordinary. He had changed the oil in the tractor. A fence needed repairing before winter. Claire had called from Texas and sounded happy. Reading those simple thoughts made me smile. On October 17th, Dad wrote that Brian had visited and asked about our future. Dad mentioned marriage. Brian smiled, but his eyes stayed on the paperwork covering the table. The next page listed Brian's questions. How much land came with the farm? Would I inherit it? Were there debts? Had an oil company asked about the mineral rights? I frowned. I had not even known our property had mineral rights. Dad answered carefully, then recorded the detail that hurt most. Brian never asked how I was doing, not once. At the time, I would have defended him as planning for our future. Now I could not. The journals grew more personal. Dad never called Brian bad. He only recorded facts. Brian borrowed $3,000 for credit cards, then more, then $5,000. Brian had claimed he was financially secure and handled our bills, savings, and retirement. I had trusted him. Dad's pages showed another truth. Brian asked Dad not to tell me because I worried too much. Dad did not believe him. More loans and promises followed. Some were repaid, most were not. Dad had protected Brian's pride so I could balance military life, marriage, and motherhood without more stress. I wondered how many sacrifices he had hidden from me. Near dawn, I found an entry from 6 months before Dad died. I had called and sounded happy. Brian still smiled around me, and Dad hoped it was real. Then, if she ever comes back to this house alone, I'll know I was right to prepare. I could not read another word. I closed the journal and pressed both hands against my face. I had blamed my injury, my limp, and the body that had not returned as Brian expected. Surrounded by Dad's notebooks, I understood another truth. Brian had not left because I was wounded. He left because, in his eyes, I had stopped being useful. My injury had not changed who he was. It had exposed him. At sunrise, Emma entered, saw the journals, and asked whether Grandpa had written them all. I said yes. She climbed into my lap and asked what I had learned. I held her and said Grandpa had spent years protecting us. Now it was my turn to finish what he started. The first week brought no miracle or instant solution. I woke before 6 because my legs stiffened in bed. The army doctors were right about mornings. I sat on the edge of Dad's old bed, rubbing my knee until I could stand. Emma noticed everything, but she never complained. One morning, she quietly carried my boots into the kitchen before I asked. She said she thought it would save me a trip upstairs. I asked when she had become so thoughtful. She shrugged and said, "I've been watching you. Children do not listen as much as they watch." I wanted Emma to see that when life falls apart, sometimes you rebuild it yourself. The farmhouse needed nearly everything. The roof leaked over the back bedroom, half the porch railing had rotted. The water heater made a violent banging noise whenever anyone turned on the shower. The barn leaned just enough to make me nervous when the wind rose. One afternoon I stood on the porch with a yellow legal pad and made a list. Roof, plumbing, electrical inspection, windows, paint. Every item had a price beside it, and every price reminded me that Brian had emptied our joint checking account 2 days before I came home. The bank confirmed Brian was authorized to withdraw the money, leaving little legal recourse. I drove home furious. Losing the savings hurt. Discovering what my trust meant to him hurt more. Days later, I met Harold Benson above an old Winchester pharmacy. In his 70s, wearing suspenders and sliding reading glasses, he smiled when I introduced myself. "I've been expecting you." I laughed softly and told him that was becoming a theme. He chuckled and said my father had planned farther ahead than almost anyone he had known. Harold explained the trust. Dad had invested steadily, avoided debt, and taken no foolish risks. The 38-acre farm, mineral rights, investments, and untouched life insurance were worth far more than I imagined. I sat there speechless. I told Harold I had no idea. He said my father wanted it that way because he believed inheritance changed people. I thought of Brian and realized Dad may have been right. Then Harold showed me legal documents bearing Brian's signature. 15 years earlier, when Dad refinanced part of the property, Brian signed an acknowledgement that the estate belonged solely to me. I looked at Harold. He knew? He absolutely knew. Brian had not guessed. He had known for years while pretending money did not matter. Outside, I understood that Brian had taken my house, marriage, savings, and confidence. Because of Dad, he had not taken my future. That evening, Walter found me sitting on the porch with a hammer in one hand and a loose board at my feet. He asked whether I planned to fix it myself. I told him I could try. He grinned and said he had known me since I was 8 and that I had inherited Frank's stubbornness. I admitted I probably had. Walter laughed. "Good, you're going to need every bit of it." I smiled for the first time in days. Somehow, hearing that from an old family friend felt better than any speech about staying strong. The next morning, I started repairing the porch one board at a time, exactly as I intended to repair my life one day at a time. By the second week, the porch was finished. One board sat high, and the paint did not match, but each morning I saw proof that I could rebuild something. That was exactly what I was doing with my life. I stretched before sunrise, made Emma breakfast, drove her to Miller Creek Elementary, and returned to repairs. Some days my leg cooperated. Others reminded me why I was medically retired. I hated asking for help. The Army teaches you to solve problems, not become one. Walter understood. One Saturday, 6 pickup trucks arrived. Men and women unloaded tools, ladders, paint, and enough lumber to rebuild half the county. I looked at Walter. "What is all this?" He grinned. "I made a few phone calls." A broad-shouldered man in a faded marine cap introduced himself as Mike Reynolds. When I said I had been Army, he laughed. "Once Army, always Army." Susan arrived with paintbrushes and said her husband had served with the 101st. She pointed at the house. "That roof isn't going to fix itself." Within 30 minutes, people were repairing the roof, shutters, and fences. Nobody asked for money. They simply showed up. I told Mike I could not let them do all that work. He looked at me as though I had said something ridiculous. "You already did your part." I told him I had only driven trucks and managed supplies. He smiled and said those supplies had kept people alive. There was not much I could say after that. At lunch, Walter's table filled with sandwiches, potato salad, lemonade, and pies. Mrs. Carter gave Emma cookies. When Emma proudly said she was sorting Grandpa's tools, "Mrs. Carter called her the foreman, and she giggled. It was the first carefree laugh I had heard from my daughter since the night we left Lexington. That alone made the entire day worthwhile. Some volunteers had not seen me since high school, yet they came without being asked. The people I had lived with for 20 years had abandoned me. Life was showing me who family truly was. Later that afternoon, Harold Benson pulled into the driveway carrying a thick folder. He said he thought I would want to see what he had found. We sat on the porch while the others continued working. Harold explained that he had reviewed every document my father left, and there was another layer to the protection Dad had created. He was not only protecting the property, he was protecting me from exactly the situation I was facing. The postnuptial waiver again carried Brian's signature. He had acknowledged that neither he nor his heirs would ever claim Dad's estate. I asked what would happen if Brian decided to fight me. Harold smiled and said Brian could try. Then his expression turned serious. But he'll lose. For the first time since Lexington, I felt safe because Dad had loved me enough to think 10 steps ahead. That evening, Emma and I watched the sunset turn the fields gold. She said Grandpa had known we would come home. Maybe not when, I thought, but he had made sure we would not face it alone. A month later, life settled. Emma loved school. Principal Harper introduced her to Lily, who became her best friend. They rode bicycles along Miller Creek Road until the porch light came on. Her laughter made every sore muscle worth it. I spent my mornings repairing the farmhouse and my afternoons helping Mike with inventory at his hardware store in town. The work was not glamorous, but after years of military schedules and paperwork, there was something comforting about helping customers find the right screws or loading bags of mulch into pickup trucks. People knew my name. They asked about Emma and about my leg. Not one of them made me feel like a burden. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed again. I had just returned from town when I noticed a black BMW parked in front of the farmhouse. My stomach tightened immediately. Brian stood beside it in pressed jeans and the blue shirt I bought for our 15th anniversary. For a second, the past month vanished. Then I remembered the suitcase, the rain, and Emma crying. Brian smiled nervously. Claire. I did not smile back. I asked what he was doing there. He said he hoped we could talk, then glanced toward the house and said he had brought something for Emma. He produced gift bags, a bicycle helmet, books, and an enormous stuffed dog, the kind of presents wrapped in guilt. Emma stepped onto the porch behind me. Dad. His face softened. Hey, Peanut. She did not run to him. She stayed beside me. That told me more than words could have. Brian admitted mistakes. He said he had panicked, started blaming Linda, then stopped and accepted his choices. It was the first honest thing I had heard from him in weeks. He told me he had been seeing a counselor and had spent a lot of time thinking. He said he missed his family. I wanted to believe him. 20 years of birthdays, camping trips, Emma learning to ride, and late-night retirement plans did not disappear overnight. He took one careful step closer and said he knew he did not deserve another chance, but perhaps someday we could. Before he finished, another car entered the driveway. Linda climbed out in expensive sunglasses and a practiced smile. Oh, Claire, I've missed you. A month earlier, she had sent us into a storm. Now she acted as if it had been a misunderstanding. She reached for Emma, who stepped behind me. Linda's smile flickered as she said families forgave regrettable words. Walter happened to be crossing the neighboring pasture with a bucket of feed. He glanced toward the driveway, then wisely continued walking. He knew this was not his conversation. Brian looked at me and said we could fix everything. We could sell the farmhouse, return to Lexington, and start over. Once, those words would have broken me. Before I answered, Emma tugged my sleeve. She faced Brian and Linda. Her voice was quiet, but every word landed like a stone. If you loved us, why did you leave us in the rain? Brian stared at the gravel. Linda had no answer. Emma was not angry, only confused. Children ask what adults avoid. My daughter had already given the only answer needed. I told Brian I hoped counseling helped him, but some doors did not reopen after being closed. Brian nodded like a man finally understanding what he had lost. Linda argued with him as they drove away. I thought it was over. I could not have been more wrong. 3 days later, Harold called. His voice was unusually serious. Brian had filed a lawsuit. The next morning, I sat in Harold's office with a deployment-sized knot in my stomach and read the complaint. Brian claimed I had manipulated a confused Frank Miller into changing his estate plan. Dad had died 18 years earlier, and I was overseas when most documents were signed. I asked how Brian could file it. Harold said anyone could file. Winning was different. Brian likely wanted to frighten me into settling. I laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because it was unbelievable. Brian had thrown me out, emptied our bank account, and now wanted my father's farm. Harold nodded. Greed rarely knows when to stop. Word traveled through the county faster than I expected. By Friday, people at the hardware store were quietly asking Mike whether everything was all right. At the Miller Creek Diner, 2 older women stopped me near the register and said they were praying for me. Their kindness surprised me. Small towns have long memories, but they also recognize who shows up honestly. Brian, in contrast, had barely visited Miller Creek in 20 years. The hearing was set for the Clark County Courthouse. I wore my Navy retirement suit but left my medals home. This was about Dad, not my service. Emma hugged me before school. Walter drove me in silence, which was exactly what I needed. Almost every seat behind us was filled by Mike, Susan, Mrs. Carter, VFW veterans, and even my former English teacher. I had not realized how many people stood beside me. Across the aisle sat Brian and Linda. Brian looked confident. Linda looked impatient. Their attorney portrayed Dad as a lonely, weak man manipulated by his daughter. My hands clenched beneath the table. Then Harold rose and walked calmly to the podium. He told the judge the case was not about assumptions. It was about evidence. He produced Dad's verified, dated, signed journals, then the original trust, notarized signatures, and property records. Every date matched. Every witness was accounted for. Walter calmly testified when Dad gave him the envelope, why he kept it, and what Dad said. Brian's attorney tried to undermine him by asking whether, at his age, he could truly trust his memory. Walter smiled. I'm 83. I forget where I leave my truck keys, but I don't forget promises I made to my best friend. The gallery smiled, and even the judge softened. Then Harold presented one final exhibit, Brian's signed waiver, the document acknowledging that he had no legal claim to Frank Miller's estate. The courtroom fell silent. Brian's confidence vanished. The case was not unfolding as he imagined. His attorney cleared his throat and requested a recess. The judge glanced at the waiver and granted 10 minutes. During recess, Harold said Brian had not expected the waiver. He had underestimated how far ahead Dad planned. Brian paced by the windows while Linda talked at him. They were finally out of excuses. After recess, Brian's attorney called the journals one-sided opinions that did not prove intent. Harold agreed, surprising him, then introduced bank records. The records showed every transfer moving from Dad's account into Brian's. Brian shifted in his chair. Handwritten receipts matched the journals. 3,000, 5,000, 1,200, 800. Year after year, Brian signed the same promise. I'll pay you back soon. Harold looked toward him and asked whether he had. Brian stared at the table. His lawyer answered that his client was not on trial over personal loans. Harold said the loans established the true relationship. Dad repeatedly helped Brian, not the other way around. Brian needed Dad to look confused. Instead, the evidence showed a careful father documenting everything to protect me. Linda asked to speak. She said Brian loved me, families argued, and we should not destroy one another over old misunderstandings. Throwing us into a storm, emptying our account, and suing for Dad's estate were not misunderstandings. The judge said family disagreements were irrelevant. Only legal basis mattered. Linda sat down with nothing left to say. The judge found no evidence Dad lacked capacity. The estate documents, trust, and Brian's waiver were valid. The case was dismissed with prejudice. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Even I knew what those words meant. Brian could not simply file the same claim again. The judge told Brian the suit should never have been filed and warned against further action. Brian's shoulders dropped. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. Outside, a reporter asked for comment. I watched Brian enter his car and remembered Dad's words. You do not have to win every argument. Sometimes living well is enough. I said I had nothing to add. Walter waited with the same gentle smile he wore the night he gave me the envelope, and we walked away together. I was not walking perfectly, and I probably never would again, but for the first time since returning home, I was not carrying the weight alone. Life did not suddenly become perfect after the courthouse. Real life rarely works that way. The roof still needed another section replaced before winter. My legs still ached whenever a cold front moved through Kentucky. Some mornings I reached for my phone and forgot, for one brief second, that there was no husband waiting for a good morning message. Healing is not a straight line. It is a collection of ordinary days that slowly become easier to carry. By spring, the porch was white, flower beds bloomed, and Emma and I planted tomatoes, beans, and peppers in Dad's old garden. Emma said Grandpa would laugh at our crooked rows. I said he would quietly straighten them after we went inside. She thought she would have liked him. I knew she would. Walter still stopped by almost every evening. Sometimes he brought sweet corn. Sometimes he carried fresh biscuits his daughter had baked. Sometimes he brought nothing at all. He would simply sit on the porch with me, 2 glasses of iced tea between us, while we watched the sun disappear behind the hills. Those quiet evenings became some of my favorite moments. Mike convinced me to restore furniture in Dad's barn. I knew nothing about antiques, but he said I would learn. He was right. The first rocking chair took 3 weeks, the second 10 days. Soon, people from Winchester, Richmond, and Lexington brought family heirlooms to repair. Giving broken things another chance satisfied me deeply. Strangely, that work helped me understand that not everything broken should be restored. Furniture, yes. Trust, not always. One Saturday, Harold brought final paperwork closing the case. No appeals, claims, or more attorney letters. I signed, thanked him, and expected triumph. Instead, I felt peace. Revenge was not watching Brian lose. Victory came when I stopped measuring my future by what he took. I heard Brian left Lexington for a sales job in another state. I never learned where. Linda never contacted me. I hoped they found what they sought. Bitterness would have given them one final piece of my life, and I refused. One evening, Emma and I placed flowers at Dad's grave. Holding my hand, she asked whether Grandpa knew he would still be caring for us. The stone read, Frank Miller, beloved husband, proud father, United States Army veteran. I smiled through my tears and told her I believed Grandpa understood that love did not stop simply because someone was gone. Walking home, I understood that Dad had not saved me by leaving a farm. He saved me by leaving the truth. That truth stopped me from begging for love from people who had withheld it. Sometimes the hardest road leads back to the people and values that protected you all along. Thank you for spending this time with me. If my journey reminded you of someone you love, or yourself, carry that reminder with you. And if you value stories of resilience, justice, and second chances, I would be honored to have you join me again. The end.